Okay. Good afternoon. Um, and thank you to those who are joining, for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. I'm hoping a few more folks come in, with the new link that came in through the Eventbrite. Um, but just a heads up, this is being recorded, and if you want to engage, with us during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature. So with that, I'll get started. My name is Ross Baker. I am on the School Justice Project here at Advocates for Children, and I'm going to talk today about navigating school discipline in New York City. So a roadmap of today's training is we're going to do an introduction, go over types of suspensions and parents' rights, legal protections for students with disabilities, and then the key takeaways. So just briefly, typically we do a behavioral supports webinar as well. Um, but before we get into talking about discipline, it's important to talk about what supports are available. So here we just have a few that we mentioned that are available in different New York City public schools. So at-risk counseling, informal behavior interventions, crisis de-escalation plans, students in temporary housing, community coordinators, single shepherd, and then school-based mental health services. Um, and these kind of range from in-class interventions to time-limited counseling, which would be like the at-risk counseling, for example, to planning for students who are in crisis. And then there's a really large kind of continuum of what's available for school-based mental health services. Um, these are some examples. For the sake of this presentation, since we're going to talk a bit more about discipline and we're a little bit behind on time, um, I'll save the in-depth information for these ones for another webinar. But we have linked in the presentation here, which you all will receive through Eventbrite, a little bit more of a comprehensive guide to the different types of school-based mental health services that are available. And the way you find them is you go on your school's DOE website, on schoolsearch.schools.nyc. Um, you go to your school and then you click on the mental health and wellness tab. And then from there, you should be able to see what supports are available. Um, so yeah, that's how you access that. And hello and thank you to folks who are still joining, and apologies for the confusion with the sharing of links. So, in the School Justice Project at Advocates for Children, um, we do a lot of work around suspension and discipline, which is what I'm going to be talking to you today about. So our work aims to help young people who are facing juvenile and or criminal justice system involvement, school suspension, exclusion from school due to behavior, bullying behavior, and we advocate for alternatives to discipline and for behavior supports and services so students remain in school. We participate in city and statewide coalitions to reform school discipline policies and procedures and advocate for investments and supports for students. So that's kind of uh, what informs the work we do and what will inform this presentation. And for those who just joined, if you want to communicate with us, please use the Q&A feature. And again, apologies and thank you for bearing with our technical difficulties. So why is this work important? Students who are suspended are more likely to miss class, be held back a grade, be suspended again, drop out, get arrested. Obviously, um, this is just based on data. It's not saying that any student who's suspended is um, guaranteed to have one of these things happen to them. But we've found through looking at some of our data that students who have been suspended are more represented in these sort of categories down the line. Additionally, why is this work important? Because suspensions are not distributed equally. So, for example, we see that Black students are suspended at a rate far higher than their enrollment in New York City public schools. Um, the same is true of students with disabilities. So Black students and students with disabilities are overrepresented in superintendent suspensions relative to their enrollment in New York City public schools. And then also students in foster care are suspended at almost 4 times the rate at which students not in foster care are suspended. And this is based on data that we recently released from that we collected during the 2024-2025 school year. Um, and like I said before, if you're on the Eventbrite, we'll make sure that you're getting a copy of this presentation so you can link to these reports and any of the other links included in the presentation. So, um, real quick, I'm just going to go through a little overview of some rules around school discipline and around school removals. Um, Sometimes we do this as like an interactive poll. For the sake of time, I'm just going to go through these because we were set back a little bit because of the technical difficulties. Um, so my apologies for that, but I do want to convey the points of the presentation to you all. So um, schools often call parents to come pick up their child early. While this happens a lot, it's technically not a formal removal that New York City public schools are allowed to do. There are 3 types of removals they can pursue, but calling you to come pick up your child with no other form of notice or nothing else, or no documentation to accompany it is not something that should happen. Your child should not need a doctor's approval to come back following a suspension or any type of school removal. Um, it's not required that you meet with the principal before your child comes back to school following a suspension. Sometimes it's encouraged, and sometimes a school might suggest a welcome back circle, but it's not a requirement. Um, and The principal can call EMS if they believe the student is a danger to themselves or the school community. Um, this is a little bit of a gray area. Um, the principal does have this right. However, um, it's supposed to be reserved only in circumstances where there's like an extreme risk of harm or danger to students or the school community. This isn't supposed to be like a first line of response if a student is misbehaving. Um, but the reason we bring this up is because unfortunately we see this a fair amount um, in New York City public schools. And then lastly, a student can be suspended for a year. However, there are several protections which would prevent a student from being suspended for a year. And I'll talk about those soon. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, in talking about the school's ability to call you to come pick up your child early, um, there are formal types of removals that are allowed and are included in the discipline code and the chancellor's regulations for New York City public schools. So all of this information is coming from the discipline code, which is a handbook that every parent should have. And schools are supposed to support parents in having access to these. As you'll see, there are 2 different discipline codes, one for students grades K to 5 and one for students grades 6 to 12. Um, Also, I know that I mentioned these are discipline codes, but these also are guidelines for students and schools as well. So while there is some information about like behaviors that are not allowed or behaviors that might result in some form of discipline, there's also a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities and protections for students as it relates to discipline and as it relates to behavior in school and their due process throughout those processes. So an example here, this is like what a disciplinary infraction would look like in the discipline code. So you can see that it has a corresponding code, um, and it essentially shows like the rule or the disciplinary measure that a student might be alleged to have infracted upon. And then the second part shows the possible disciplinary responses. So on the left, there's supports and interventions, and those should be tried and implemented before resulting in any disciplinary responses. New York City Public Schools aims to practice progressive discipline, which means that the aim is to offer positive behavior interventions and behavioral supports prior to issuing any disciplinary responses. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of an issue with my headphone down here. Um, but as you can see, there's kind of a range between both portions here, and schools aren't supposed to immediately jump to, the furthest extreme on this right-hand side as it relates to discipline. So there are three types of removals that are allowed. The first is a teacher's removal. This is up to 4 days. This is from a specific classroom, so this isn't, a removal from the entire school or entire school programming. This is only from a specific classroom. Um, you must receive a phone call from a teacher, and you can ask for a meeting with a teacher to discuss this type of removal and why it's happening. The next is a principal suspension. These are often served in school or like in a central location within the school. And these can be up to 5 days. The principal must hold a conference and you must receive a written notice of the suspension within 24 hours. Um, you have the right to question the school at the principal's hearing, and you have a right to present your version or your child's version of what happened. Um, but these are typically served in school once they're issued, um, and a student is usually removed from a classroom while this is served. The most severe form is superintendent suspension. This can be from 6 to 20 days. Occasionally, these can be over 20 days, but these are only for extremely serious infractions. This requires a formal hearing at a borough suspension office. This also requires written notice within 24 hours. And while the student is serving a superintendent suspension, they are assigned to an alternative learning center, usually, which is a different building in the borough where they will attend school during their suspension. So these are the types of removals that are allowed in New York City public schools. So no other types of removals are allowed. These are the three that are in the discipline code and chancellor's regulations. So as I mentioned before, and I see we have a few new people joining us. But as I mentioned before, students can serve a year-long suspension, for example. Um, However, these are very rare, um, and a student can in fact be expelled, but only if they're over 17 and don't have an IEP. So no student with an IEP can be expelled in the DOE. I just got a question. Does that also apply to children in District 75 district schools as well? And the answer is yes. They should follow the same type of um, disciplinary responses and they have the same rights in the disciplinary process. So if that's not the case in your child's D75 school, I would definitely recommend reaching out to us, and I'll give some information about how to do that at the end of the presentation. Um, Schools cannot use corporal punishment, so they can't inflict harm to a student in any capacity, uh, hitting or verbally abusing them. And then schools cannot transfer a student without parents' permission. So sometimes I'll be working with a family who might be attending a suspension hearing, and the school will have told them, we don't want your student to come back to school when the suspension is over. Schools can't really do that. They can say that, but they don't have that right to forcibly transfer a student without the family's permission. So as I mentioned before, there must be a notice to parents within 24 hours for a principal suspension. Additionally, parents should receive a statement of students' rights, the reasons for the suspension, including the date, time, and place of incident. The period of removal and alternative instruction. So that means like where they'll be during the suspension. And usually that is for a principal suspension, usually it's in their regular school, in a central area like a principal's office or a library. And then the date, time, and place of the suspension conference with the principal. Students must stay in class until the suspension conference unless there's a legitimate threat of danger, which I mentioned before. This one's a little tricky because, schools can they'll make an argument um, if they don't want the student in school, but it really is reserved for there being a legitimate threat of danger for a student not to be in class until the suspension conference. The principal must attend the suspension conference to decide if the suspension is justified. But parents have a right to present the student's version and question any witnesses. Parents have the right to an interpreter for this process. And then parents also have the right to discuss a plan to address this behavior. So now shifting gears to a superintendent suspension notice. Within 24 hours, parents should get a notice with the reasons for suspension, alternate school location, um, details about hearing, so when and where the hearing will be, a potential witness list, so who could come to the hearing, and then parents' rights and places to call for help or representation at the hearing. Um, and like we're included in that list, for example. But that should go out within 24 hours to all parents, and that notification should include all of these details so parents are aware of their rights. So here is just a sample of what that looks like. So in red here, we have where the student will go during their superintendent suspension. So this is their alternate learning center where they'll spend the school day during the course of the suspension. Um, and then down here, there's the suspension hearing office, date and time, and how to contact them. And then the second page has the charge itself, which is what you see up here. So on 4/17/18 at approximately 2 p.m., Sam's student engaged in physically aggressive behavior as he swung his fist at Tina teacher. And then there's always this line here that says this behavior constitutes a danger to the health, safety, welfare, and morals of your child and others at the school. The reason I mention this is because sometimes I'll have parents ask why a school said this about their student because it does seem really harsh. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure why this is part of the superintendent suspension notice, but it is part of everyone, and it's not to single a child out or single a student out. And then towards the bottom, you can see that there's a non-binding witness list, including Tina teacher. So that means Tina teacher could show up to the hearing. The next component of a superintendent suspension packet or of a superintendent suspension is the suspension packet. And this is a bit different from the actual suspension notice, because this has basically all the documents that are included in the school's case to try to, prove the charge that they're alleging. Um, we will send out slides of the presentation. We'll send them to anyone who's registered for the Eventbrite. Um, so I'll make sure that those are sent out and they have access to links or any documents that I discussed in the presentation. That's a good question. So the school suspension, student suspension packet should have witness statements, a records cover sheet indicating what's in the suspension packet, an evidence voucher if they're using like a school video or something, any injury reports if those are part of the alleged charges, and then other school records. Um, and the school must give this to families before the hearing. We always advocate that as soon as you receive a suspension notice, that you reach out and ask for the packet. It's super helpful to have this as early as possible so you know how you want to proceed in a superintendent suspension hearing. So this is just an example of what the cover sheet looks like for the packet. So there's all this demographic information at the top. Um, there's academic information, suspension history, um, And then the second part of this page, it's kind of like one of those legal sheets, so it's longer than a regular piece of paper. It has disciplinary information from before, any prior guidance or interventions that the school has tried. And then at the bottom, it has a recommendation for how long the suspension will be. And the date of any current IEP or 504 plan. This is an example of a witness statement. So uh, this is part of how a school investigates any alleged behavioral infractions. Sometimes they'll ask students to write witness statements. So they might collect witness statements from a student, from a teacher, administrator, someone present at the incident. It's important to know that a statement alone can't be used to prove a charge. Um, if someone writes a statement, they also will have to show up at a hearing to um, give live testimony to provide the school with evidence. I think shortly in the new year, we're going to try to do a webinar actually on defending suspended students, where we'll get into a little bit more of the detail of how to actually represent a student in a suspension hearing. Um, but this is just an overview and what this piece of evidence looks like. And just now, while I'm discussing this, I'll note, um, students have the right to refuse to write a statement. So, I mean, I think it's important that uh, children know this, and that if a school asks them to write a statement, they are not required to write a statement. Um, so this is the occurrence report. This is how the school enters any behavioral issue or incident in their system in ORS. Um, and this basically isn't necessarily a piece of evidence in the hearing, but it's how the school records the incident, and how it gets sent to the superintendent suspension hearings office. So at this hearing, you have three options. One is to adjourn for a good cause. So this might be, this happens a lot when families don't know that they're able to get representation, for example. And then they get to a hearing and they'll be told by the hearing office, like, oh, do you have an advocate or an attorney with you? And they might not know that was an option. So then they will adjourn because they're trying to find someone to help them at the hearing. Unfortunately, though, if the parent adjourns, then the student remains out of school until the hearing. So in some cases, it could actually prolong the time a student is out of school. If the school adjourns, then the student returns to school until uh, the hearing happens. And schools might adjourn because they might not have realized they had to bring a witness, or they just might not show up for some reason. Um, able to share the Zoom link in the chat. Someone wants to log into the webinar. Yeah, uh, I can do that. Give me 1 second. Um, okay. Well, I am gonna grab the Zoom link real quick. I'll try to maybe let me ask. There was another question in the chat. How about if the students are if statements are written with children with disabilities, can these statements be used, or how does that work? Um, those statements can be used, but again, there has to be live testimony for that student's statement to be considered as part of evidence. Furthermore, statements can be dictated by a student. So if they can't write the statement themselves, they could dictate it to um, a school official. Um, but it is important to ask the question during the hearing about the context of how a statement was taken. Um, and additionally, I'm going to talk a little bit more in a second about some protections for students with disabilities. I'm going to stop the share for just 1 second. Um, just so I can grab the link for the presentation. I know that someone just asked for it. So I'm going to try to put it in the chat real quick, and then I'll continue on with the presentation. So thank you for for bearing with me. Today's been a little bit of a weird day with the technical difficulties we've had in trying to get this presentation going. So I just shared the link in the chat. Um, I'll continue on, but please continue to ask questions. Um, and yeah, I'll get to a section in a second where I talk a little bit more about protections for students with disabilities. Um, the second option at a superintendent suspension hearing is a plea of no contest. So this isn't an admission of the charge, it's just accepting the charge. So it's not saying, yes, I did this, or no, I didn't do this, or this is exactly what happened. It's just saying, I accept the charge and I don't want to go to a hearing. Reasons this might happen is because, you know, sometimes a charge might actually be less severe than what the evidence would suggest if a school were to bring evidence. Um, and so it might be easier for a family to plead no contest. And then the third option is to proceed with the hearing. So after the hearing, the within 2 days of the hearing, the parent must receive notification of whether the charges are dismissed or sustained. If the charge is sustained, where student is assigned to attend school, so where their alternate learning center will be, usually it's the same place they've been attending prior to the hearing. How the suspension will be reflected in the student's records, including when it will be expunged. And then within 5 days of hearing, the hearing office must mail a full report of the findings of fact and disposition to the parent. So this will be like how long the or how the hearing office came to the decision, if they found testimony credible, that sort of thing. Um, so for most infractions, the superintendent's office has the ability to immediately reinstate a student, continue the suspension for up to 20 days. For very serious behavior, only by main office approval in New York City Public Schools can a suspension be continued for more than 20 days or up to a year. There's an automatic review for 40 or more school days. And then also expulsion is possible, but again, this is only possible for students who are over 17 and do not have an IEP. Um, and the one thing I'll mention is that this is just for New York City public schools. This does not apply to charter schools. So charter schools have their own discipline code, so they do have the right to expel students should they choose to. And there are some ways to uh, challenge that, but it's not through this process. The superintendent's office also can recommend additional services and then grant or deny a school transfer if the parent requests that. So, families have the right to appeal a superintendent suspension decision. There's two levels of an appeal. So the first is the chancellor's office or an office of legal services. Um, and to do this, you request a transcript of the hearing because the hearings are recorded. Um, and you have 20 days from the date of the decision or 10 days from the receipt of the tape recording or hearing transcript. And you can appeal and explain why you think the decision is incorrect. And then if that's unsuccessful, you can appeal to the New York State Education Commissioner, and you must initiate within 30 days of decision unless the delay is excused by commissioner for a good cause shown in the petition. Um, so during alternative instruction, students should still be receiving homework, classwork, exams, and full-time instruction. I'll explain why there's an asterisk there in a sec. So for students from kindergarten to eighth grade, they must receive um, full-time instruction while serving a principal suspension or waiting for a superintendent suspension hearing. High school, they have to be there for at least 2 hours a day, but they should still be receiving all relevant coursework. And then after a suspension hearing, all students who continue to be suspended have a right to full-time instruction. A note here, if a student is suspended during a period where there are regents or state exams, they are supposed to go to their home school to take those tests. A suspension should not get in the way of taking those tests. All right, so now I'm gonna shift gears here, and thank you all for bearing with me. I know the pace of this has been really fast. Um, and we had some technical difficulties. So, again, I appreciate the patience, and we will share these slides with you all shortly after this. I don't know whether it will be today or in the coming days, but you will get the slides and the recording of this presentation. So, students with disabilities, if suspended or in a disciplinary situation, have a right to expedited evaluations. So if they're suspected of having a disability, but they haven't been evaluated, they have the right to an expedited evaluation. Um, how about if a suspension causes severe emotional distress and they can no longer physically and mentally go back to school? Um, that's a good question. Do we have a YouTube channel? Yes, we do. And I can um, see if that can be shared in the Eventbrite, where you can access more webinars. If a student can no longer physically and mentally go back to school, that sounds like it might be an issue to address through um, an IEP or special ed, possibly, um, because it sounds like a student might need an alternative placement or a therapeutic placement, in which there's a process to try to support in getting that. Um, There's also home instruction, or, as a parent, you have the right to request a school transfer if a student doesn't want to return to a specific school. Um, the school can't force you to transfer, but you do have a right to request a transfer. And um, honestly, if I wouldn't say a fair amount, but some amount of parents that we work with, for example, will do that following a suspension. Um, So the next protection that I'll discuss is a manifestation determination review. Um, then there's a suspension plan, which is the plan for how a student will receive their services during the suspension, and then a functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan. So uh, since I was discussing expedited evaluations, who is a student with a disability for discipline purposes? Students with IEPs, students with 504 plans, or students where the school was deemed to know that the student might have a disability. Um, and if a student is not qualified as having a disability but is suspected of having a disability, um, the family has a right to request an expedited evaluation to see if they can get special ed protections during a suspension hearing process. So, um, the parent requests an initial evaluation, or the school is deemed to know a student has a disability, meaning that there's evidence or a suspicion that a student has a disability based on academic performance, behavior, grades, that sort of thing, and it hasn't been addressed by the school. Then expedited evaluations can happen, and they must be done within 15 days of parental consent. A manifestation determination review is a meeting that happens after superintendent suspension. And this is a meeting to determine whether a student's behavior was caused by the student's disability or a result of the school's failure to follow the student's IEP or behavioral intervention plan. So, if a behavior is a manifestation, then the student returns to school. The school must do a functional behavioral assessment, um, and then create a behavior intervention plan based off that assessment. I'll talk about what those are shortly. Um, if it's not a manifestation, then the school must create a suspension plan. So create a plan to determine how a student will receive their special ed services while serving the suspension, and then consider doing a functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan, despite it not being a manifestation of their disability. So a school must hold an MDR if a student is suspended for 11 or more days in a row within 40 school days, or if there's a pattern. So sometimes, for example, I'll work with families and um, they will, uh, there might be a really strong case for an MDR. So maybe they'll plead no contest at a superintendent suspension hearing, but then they won't get the MDR because the suspension only lasts 5 or 6 days. Um, so there has to be 10 days of suspension, whether it's principal suspension or superintendent suspension, but over 10 cumulative days for an MDR to kick in. So what's reviewed during an MDR? Um, the IEP, the FBA and BIP, if there is one, any evaluations and teacher observations, occurrence reports, records from the parent, and other information. Um, okay, what about if the student with disability never had a behavior plan, never been in trouble, but the treatment of a teacher was inhumane, but MDR determined it was not an MDR because they were an exceptional student? Um, Sounds like a very specific circumstance. I would encourage you to maybe get in touch with us, but um, I think it kind of speaks to what's also reviewed during the MDR. So, parents are empowered to bring in records or any additional observations that the school should be aware of. So whether this is a provider a child sees outside of school, who can speak to the nature of the student's disability, um, or, reports from a student's doctor, something that speaks to the nature of the disability and how it relates to their behavior in school. Um, so who attends an MDR uh, is, let's see here. No, I don't have this slide, but an MDR should be attended by a special ed teacher, um, parents, someone from the school district who's knowledgeable about the student's disability, but also knowledgeable about the services offered by the district to determine whether the services were actually um, happening or being implemented. So sometimes those roles can be occupied by one person. Um, and they use this worksheet, which is available online, to go through the questions to see if something meets the criteria for a manifestation. So whether a behavior was a manifestation of a student's disability, or whether it was a manifestation of the school's inability to implement the IEP or FBA or BIP if they have one of those. Um, and ultimately, the decision should be made together. Um, the school does have the ultimate say. So I've been in many cases where a school psychologist or someone from the district might rule that it's not a manifestation, but there are ways, in fact, to appeal an MDR decision that you disagree with. So preparing for an MDR, review all documents, make sure a student is getting all services on their IEP. This is really important. If they're not, then it's really important to raise this at the MDR because their disability is not being supported as it should legally. Um, Not just the principal, assistant principal, and the parent advocate. Probably not unless the principal or assistant principal has a role um, as like part of the local special ed in the local special ed office or provides special ed services within the school. There should be someone knowledgeable about the special ed uh, process at the school and about the student's disability, who is also a professional, either special ed teacher, district representative, or school psychologist. So no, it shouldn't just be between like the admin and the parent. That um, I think would be pretty easy grounds for appealing an MDR. Um, and then, like I mentioned before, uh, you can ask outside providers to participate, and we always encourage folks to do that. And, that can be them participating in the meeting, or it can be them writing a bit about the student and their experience serving the student with their disability and how that disability may manifest in certain situations. So I've talked a little bit about an FBA and a BIP. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those needs, just to clarify what those means for some people, just to clarify. So an FBA is a functional behavioral assessment, and it takes a look at what the behavior is that needs to change. Um, so then the school assesses when it occurs, how often, where, and then the function. So why is the behavior occurring? And this is typically for recurring behaviors, but also for behaviors that, might necessitate an MDR. And then following the FBA, following reports, interviews, and classroom observations, then the school and the family will come together to develop a BIP. So this is a plan to address and manage the behavior. So this could be like a reward system in class, certain, amount of breaks that are set, for example, that a student must have over a course of a period of time. And then also there should be some information about how to measure progress in the BIP. So that can be how to, you know, how often will the behavior continue occurring? Uh, has the behavior become less disruptive, for example? But this is basically a way to measure it to see if the BIP is working. So, um, just some takeaways from the presentation. Schools should always try to help students before suspending them. They should always try behavioral interventions or other behavioral supports. A notice for a superintendent or principal suspension must be in writing. Um, ask for a principal suspension conference. Always get a superintendent suspension packet. And then no out-of-school suspension. So students should be receiving uh, school instruction or classwork or homework um, during any period of suspension. And that's whether it's in their home school or at an alternative learning center. Um, if you need help, uh, please reach out to us. Our helpline is open Monday through Thursday, 10 to 4 p.m. You can also reach us at info@advocatesforchildren.org. Um, and thank you all for bearing with me. I have a poll here if anyone wants to fill it out just to help us with our training as we continue to develop and get better. But like I said before, I'll make sure that these slides get sent out so you can access the slides along with any links that they include um, in the presentation. Uh, and I'll stick around for a few minutes to let people complete the poll and then also to see if I can answer any additional questions. Um, and then also I'll stick around for a minute or two after I turn off the recording in case anyone wants to try to ask like more specific questions. But if you have something that's really detailed, um, I would urge you to reach out to our helpline or to reach out to our info email, because then you can get a more detailed response. Okay, so I think I'm gonna end the poll now, um, and then I'm gonna end the um, recording, and I'll stick around for a few minutes.